Chairman, we are now live.
Thank you. Welcome to a virtual meeting of the External Services Select Committee at the London Borough of Hillingdon. This virtual meeting is also being broadcast simultaneously on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon London. The purpose of this committee is to monitor Council services and their performance within its remit and undertake in-depth reviews and witness sessions on topics, submitting any findings to the decision-making cabinet. My name is Councillor John Riley and I'm the chairman of this committee. Before we start, some important online housekeeping for everyone present. Please ensure any mobile phones around you are on silent and that any home listening devices, such as Alexa, are turned off. Please keep your microphone muted when not speaking and then unmute to speak. And I've already asked that members and guests should raise their hands so that we can see on the pictures and we'll call you in. In terms of technical meeting control, if any councillor leaves the virtual meeting partway through for a period of time or they've got a lost connection, I will continue the meeting unless we are not quorate, which is 5 councillors. Before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to do a roll call of the councillors and others present to confirm attendance. Please indicate you are present when I say your name. Councillor Nick Dennis.
I'm present, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Nicola Brightman.
Present, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Alan Chapman.
Evening, Chairman. Yes, I'm present.
Thank you. Councillor Stuart Mathers.
I'm present.
Thank you. Councillor Ali Malali.
Evening, Chairman. I'm present.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor June Nelson.
Good evening, Chairman. I'm present. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can, loud and clear. Thank you very much. Councillor Debbie Radia.
Good evening, Chairman. I'm present.
Ruth Derritt.
Chairman, I'm present.
Thank you. Jessamy Kinghorn.
Yes, I'm present. Apologies,
Thank
my
you.
computer just froze.
It's okay, don't worry. And Nikki O'Halloran.
I'm present.
Thank you, thank you. Right, we go to the agenda now. Apologies for absence. Nikki, please.
We've had apologies from Councillor Simon Arnold and Councillor Nicola Brightman's here as his substitute, and Vanessa Harangi and Councillor Alan Chapman is here as her substitute.
Thank you. Declarations of interest in matters coming before the meeting. All the usual ones being recorded, but I'll take it as none unless anyone tells me. Exclusions of press and public. All items are to be considered in part 1. I don't think there are any part 2 items. And to receive and agree the minutes of this meeting of the 8th of September of this year. Unless anyone's got anything specific, I'll take it. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for not notifying this in advance. Just on page 4, where it talks about the consultation with the hospital, we had concerns or mentioned concerns around making sure that the consultation reflected the diversity of the borough, particularly ethnic minority groups, and we were asked to make suggestions to the hospital trust with groups that may help them with that consultation or engagement, sorry, I should say.
Okay, thank you. I can see Nikki scribbling furiously, so I think that's probably going to be added. Thank you very much. Any other additions or other comments in regard to the minutes? No, I can't see anybody. All right, good. So agenda item 5 is the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre review. This is something that's been going on for some little while in one form or another, and both Ruth and Jessamy has been fantastic proponents and directors of this project. Nick and I have been to meetings and we've had updates and so forth, but there's an update for the committee. This started at a time before the plans for Hillingdon Hospital rebuild, or new build, I should say. But nevertheless, it was thought, and I completely agree with the idea that the provision of cancer services at Mount Vernon and how it fits into the whole cancer provision service picture should carry on regardless of what happened with the hospital, because at the time it started, we weren't sure what was going to happen at all. So it was, and I see Ruth nodding, so I got that right. That's good. So it's a very challenging project. It covers, as you'll have seen, or maybe as you'll have heard at least from earlier discussions, that we've had an enormous geographical area and deals with a lot of other authorities and interest groups. So I think as far as this is concerned, I'll let either Ruth or Jessamine get on with this and refer to the update, and then we'll take questions as we go along.
Thank you, Chairman. So I think how we'll do this, if that's all right with you, is I'll just run through as an update of where we are, and then Ruth will come in with one or two bits and pieces, and then we'll open it up to questions. If at any point my signal deserts me, Ruth is more than able to pitch in and take over. I did send Nikki a few slides. I'm not quite sure about whether it will work sharing my screen on here, because I'm using two different computers. So if you do want to see, at one point I'll refer to a map. So Nikki, it might be helpful if you could share the slides that I sent over earlier. So I won't go back through too much detail, as I'm sure the committee. I've been to see you all a couple of times, and we've been meeting with Councillor Riley and with Nikki in between. But the review of Mount Vernon Cancer Services has been going on, this review, for about 18 months now. It follows on from, as you'll recall, other attempts to look at how we can improve services at Mount Vernon, what we need to do. And last year we commissioned the independent clinical report, which said actually things cannot stay as they are. We need to do something. We need to do something fairly soon. And that is likely to involve a co-location of some form with an acute hospital. So since that point, we've been engaging with patients. And again, I've presented to you previously the patient reports that we had done last year, where we held some workshops and so on. And we got on with implementing the findings of the clinical report, which you will recall one of the key ones was a transfer of the management of the service from East and North Hearts Trust, which is a District General Hospital Trust, which runs the service from the Hillingdon Hospital site at the moment, Hillingdon Hospital Trust own site, I should say, but to a tertiary specialist cancer provider. And I think the last time I came to see you all in person, we were in the middle of that process. And since then, at the start of this calendar year, we undertook an assessment of proposals from different cancer providers, and had convened a panel which had quite a few stakeholders on, including Healthwatch Hillingdon. And we made a decision to appoint UCLH as the preferred provider for the cancer service. I'm going to emphasise, and I'm sure Ruth will later on as well, this is for the management of the service, not for the location of the service. This does not mean it's moving to UCLH. This is, into central London. That is certainly not our intention, and it's not one of the options that will be looked at. So we have entered a period of what we call due diligence, which I'm sure Ruth can elaborate on a little bit later, around that transfer, and that takes a period of time to do properly, and at the end of which time the UCLH board will make a decision that yes, it can go ahead. We will make a decision, yes, it can. All parties need to be on the same page with that. So that was where we were entering into that period of due diligence just as COVID hit, and of course when that happened, what happened alongside that was all of the clinical teams got pulled into responding to COVID. The UCLH team were pulled into responding to COVID. A lot of our commissioning teams were. I myself was redeployed. So the programme entered what we lovingly called a pause, from which in the summer, around about August, we decided the time was now to move things along again. So since then, we have put our foot on the gas with getting into this next phase, which is around the development of the options. So the due diligence is carrying on, but we are in what we're calling phase 2, which is where we have clinicians and patients doing a review of the existing pathways, developing options and thinking through what are the solutions to the issues that Mount Vernon faces. We are undertaking a whole load of stakeholder engagement as well to make sure that the plans meet the needs of the local populations. Most of that was contained in the August update, which you've had. And the reason we haven't done a supplementary one is because that all takes time and not a huge amount has changed since then. So for the sake of lots more paper, I thought it was probably just sensible to say since then, we've been meeting with the different systems. So by systems, we mean ICS systems and STP systems. There are 6 in the immediate area of Mount Vernon. As we said, it covers quite a big area. Today I held a workshop with Health Watch, which all of the Health Watch across the whole area were invited to. And we've revised our plans for patient involvement events so that we can do more of them online, that we can reach a larger number of people. So we are having a larger number of smaller groups online. And that's in response to feedback we've had and issues with technology and so on. And the conversation with Health Watch today was very much along the lines of how do we make sure that is inclusive and how do we reach those people who could be excluded by that approach, and what other ways are we doing it? And the other thing that we have done is we've commissioned the Consultation Institute to undertake something called quality assurance, which is far bigger and scarier than I imagined, in that they look at all our process, they look at our patient engagement, they look at our governance, and they advise us and then they assess us on how good that is. So we're going through that process because we want that assurance that our engagement consultation is of a really high standard. So that's a broad update. Nikki, are you able to share the slide at all? Sorry to put you on the spot. The slide I wanted to show you, a couple of slides. The first one, which will hopefully come up, is the geographical distribution of patients, which you'll have seen previously, but I thought it was worth a reminder. And that looks at the patient data for 2017-18, 2018-19, and does an average. Nikki, if you just jump to slide 3. That's it, thank you. So you can see here that the majority of patients come from Hertfordshire, so you have Herts Valleys there at 27% and East and North Herts at 17%. These numbers represent unique patients, not visits to the site. Hillingdon's there at 13%, and then Harrow, and then you've got Bedfordshire and Buckinghamshire, Luton, and then some other North London boroughs. If you just pop onto the next slide, Nikki, this one is a map of the area, which might illustrate it for those of us who think more visually, perhaps. Again, it's the little blue symbol in the middle, at the bottom is Mount Vernon. So you can see where it is in relation to the population it serves. The darker the purple, the larger the number of patients that come from that area, is the easiest way of describing it. To the upper right of Mount Vernon, you have Watford Hospital. Below it, you have Hillingdon and Norfolk Park and so on are in that mix too. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavour. And again, there's some 2019 figures there for which CCGs are referring to patients. And you can see the order is exactly the same. And the proportions are the same. So again, it's Hertfordshire, Hillingdon, Harrow, and then Bedfordshire. So if you just, Nikki, if you just wouldn't mind popping onto the next slide. This is just really a summary of the timetable from here on in. So as I've said, at the moment, we're in the middle of the due diligence work, which will be complete by the end of March. It takes a long time to do it thoroughly, and I'm sure Ruth can delve into some of that detail if you're interested in that. We are involving patients and clinicians in option development, and that comes to a bit of a head in early December, when we are getting a patient reference group and clinicians together to look at what the options are starting to look like and whether patient views have been properly considered and included, and whether patients have helped design that sufficiently. We've got then a whole period of detailed work to do on those options, which will include ensuring that they are actually doable. It'll be looking at all the finances behind it, all the operational information that we need, the workforce figures to see if the case can stack up, with a view to having an outline business case in March next year. Beyond March, then we get into the board at UCLH making its decision on the transfer, developing our pre-consultation business case, a likely public consultation. I think we can all agree is most probably likely to happen, and we're anticipating that in the summer, followed by enabling work for the transfer of the management to Mount Vernon from 2022. So East and North Herts will continue to run the service up until the 1st of April 2022, when UCLH take over. Part of the reason for that is so that when UCLH take over, they know what the future of Mount Vernon is, because we've gone through public consultation. It would be a little unfair for them to take on responsibility without really knowing what the future holds. So we're working very much in tandem together. We have a project team which has got members from Mount Vernon, UCLH and ourselves on it. We're meeting weekly, we're keeping the momentum going. And if you just move on to the next slide, which I promise you is the last slide, because I know it's sometimes difficult to follow in these types of forums. The patient engagement, phase 1 is complete. That's what we did last year, which formed the basis of the report. So what's happening over the next couple of months now is we've got a number of general update events where people can tune in to find out what's going on and ask questions. We're going to be doing another survey. We are developing an interactive website, and we're going to be running 30 patient focus groups that are looking at specific areas of patient pathways. We may run more if they're very popular. We may, if we find that each of the clinical pathways throws up very different issues to each other, we may start to look at other pathways as well. At the moment, we're anticipating that the issues will be broadly similar, but we don't know that for certain. We will do a little bit of work with some of the rarer cancers with those patient groups directly. We're then going to have 4 feedback workshops, which are going to enable people who've been involved in some of these focus groups to listen at how their views have been incorporated and how the clinical team have interpreted them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the patient reference group. We're also then going to be doing some very specific work, particularly I've picked out there just a learning disability and autism. The reason for that is that in Hertfordshire, deaths from cancer is one of the top 3 reasons why people with learning disabilities in Hertfordshire is one of the top causes of death. And that is not the same across the rest of the country. So we want to do a little bit of work with people with learning disabilities, and then some further work around the non-digital engagement. There is quite a wide range of options for people to get involved with. We're doing events during the day, in the evenings, on Saturdays, really just to give a bit of an opportunity really for as many people to get involved as possible. Booking for those events is currently live, and the dates have gone out, so we'll see how, and I'll obviously keep you updated with how successful those are. I think that was all I was going to sort of rattle through at the moment, so thank you, Nikki, for sharing that. I will just, with your indulgence, Chair, just ask Ruth if she wants to add anything, and then I'll hand back over to you for questions.
Thanks very much, Jessamy. Yes, I just wanted to say a couple more things about the transfer, if I could. So firstly, just to reiterate, because we have had some difficulty communicating this message because it is complex, that the transfer that we're discussing to UCLH, as Jessamy has said, is the transfer of the management of the services. When we agreed that transfer with UCLH from Eastern North Herts, there are some conditions on that transfer. The key one of those is the completion of the due diligence. You'll all appreciate, having visited the site, there are a number of risks on that site. UCLH need to be assured about the management of those risks, and they also need to look at the workforce arrangements so that they can organise the cheapy transfer of those staff. So that's quite a long process. Once they've completed that process and they're assured that we have a strong long-term plan for the future reprovision, which could then enable a change in the location of services, that decision will be approved by the UCLH board, and a business transfer agreement is then negotiated. Once that's signed off, that's the legal process complete. And then the next phase is to go through the transfer period, which takes around 6 months, which would include, of course, the cheapy consultation, transfer of the staff, all the digital arrangements, all the contracts and all the leases, etc. So it's a really complex piece of work. The second thing I wanted to say in relation to that part of the process, and in fact for the overall review, is because we've had a pause and this has taken longer than we had anticipated to complete, we've set up a critical infrastructure group to strengthen our assurance about the services on the site. And that's in addition to the short-term actions that we'd taken previously. So as I'm sure you'll appreciate, when there's a transfer between two organisations, there are then negotiations about if equipment needs to be replaced, how is that going to be managed, and all of those sorts of issues. So we've set up a separate critical infrastructure group in addition to the due diligence work. And on that group, you've got Hillingdon, Eastern North Herts, NHS England, and UCLH. So that was all I was going to say in relation to the transfer. I did want to add something about the period between March, when we paused the programme, and June, July, when we restarted the programme, was that during that time, we did continue to work with the team at Mount Vernon to assure the safety of the services on the site. So we'd already put in place additional staffing, a transition team, and a regular audit of all the admissions into the inpatient beds. And we continued to keep that process going through the COVID phase 1. We did pause all the strategic planning work at that point, as Jessamy said, so that the clinical staff could focus appropriately on managing the services effectively. So if I pause there, we're very happy to take any questions about the process, any part of that process.
All right, thank you. First of all, I've got Councillor Nick Dennis.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the presentation. I suppose my question is sort of a basic one in a sense. I read the document that Nikki sent around the other day, and it said services, the way they're delivered, are going to be changed, and I assume for the better. What I haven't picked up yet is how are they going to change and how is it going to be better? Essentially, if somebody said to me, this thing's happening, Nick, how's it going to be better and what's going to change? What should I tell them?
Okay, so if we go back to the independent clinical review, which was carried out in June of last year, the review made a number of recommendations, and one of the key recommendations that they made was that in order to provide modern cancer services, we needed to be co-located with critical care. So at the moment on the site, you have inpatient facilities, but you don't have co-located critical care. So if a patient is receiving complex treatment and their needs change, they need to be then taken to a neighbouring acute hospital. So I think one of the things that's going to change is that we do need to co-locate those services with critical care and with some other services on acute site. And the reason for that is around the immunotherapies. As you'll appreciate, the more modern cancer treatments are hugely effective, but also have a risk of complications. So we need to make sure that we have the adjacencies to manage those complications effectively. The other issues that we're looking at in relation to the model, we've asked the clinical work stream that we've established, which is made up of the Mount Vernon clinicians, plus some clinicians from UCLH, plus representatives from the Cancer Alliance, to look at what the needs of the populations are across the area that's served by Mount Vernon, which, as you've seen on the map, is quite a wide area, and to look at where could we actually take those services closer to home. We've done some, or started, not done, we've started some work with Clatterbridge, which is a centre in the north where they've moved from a standalone cancer centre onto an acute site. And we're looking at some of the innovations that they've been able to deliver through that. So if I give a few examples, and all of these things are under consideration, we can look at chemotherapy that's more networked, so it's closer to home. We can potentially look at chemotherapy in the workplace, which is, I don't know much about, but they've done in some other areas. So we can look at actually how we can take services closer to the patients rather than patients travelling, in some cases, a very long distance to the services. Does that help as an indication of the sorts of things that we're looking at?
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And obviously, in a sense, from a retail perspective, this is the stuff that I'm most interested in. I mean, obviously, the processes that you talked about, the consultation, and also making sure due diligence is done is extremely important. But that's the stuff that I suppose excites me more.
Yes, understandably so.
I think the other thing worth adding on that, if I may, is the focus groups that we're going to be running on specific pathways over the next couple of months will hopefully really flesh out from a patient perspective what they think is working really well, but actually what doesn't work well for them, and their ideas about what could change. And I'm not talking about, you know, smiling receptionist or my notes being ready. We're talking about really big fundamental changes to the pathway. This is our opportunity to really shape things differently in the future. So we want to seize it, really. We don't know what the new pathway will look like yet, but we know that this is an opportunity to change it. And hopefully in a few months' time, we'll be able to describe those new pathways in a lot more detail and how they will benefit patients.
When you were talking about, and I think we do understand very much that the transfer is transfer of management and responsibility to UCLH rather than any in a strictly practical sense. But when you were talking about, I just picked it up because I could imagine some people get a bit scared by this, the transfer of staff. You mean responsibility for staff as opposed to people having to work into central London or whatever from Mount Vernon. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So all the staff would continue and obviously have protected employment rights to continue in their current roles. So there would be a TUPE transfer, but that's about the transfer of the employment contracts rather than a physical transfer of the staff to a different location. Absolutely.
And the other thing was, and those of us who've visited the Mount Vernon site, I mean, and you say this in your document anyway, that the site and the buildings essentially are not fit for purpose, and we've known that for a long time. So, given that, some of the existing complications, when we did the visit the last time, and we talked to one of the consultants, and he sort of pointed at one of the buildings on the left-hand side, and we discovered it was both listed and condemned, which seemed to be quite an interesting combination. Given those types of very obvious problems, is there any point and or possibility of sorting that sort of thing out at an early stage rather than waiting for that type of decision to come in the process? In other words, because we know that they're not fit for purpose and because we know there are existing complications with those buildings, is there any point of addressing that at an earlier stage rather than waiting for that further down the line?
So I think when we're looking at the re-provision options, we need to look at which of the services would move onto an acute site, which services might stay potentially on the Mount Vernon site, and the investment in the backlog maintenance. And as you say, there's a serious cost to the backlog maintenance, I think needs to follow that. At the moment, because some of the services we wouldn't anticipate being on the site in the longer term, then obviously we need to balance the costs and benefits of investing on the site. I should say that the responsibility financially for the backlog maintenance on the site is with Hillingdon. So that's something that is Hillingdon Hospital's responsibility rather than East and North Herts. So there's and this is why it's particularly important that with the critical infrastructure, we have that conversation between NHS England, Hillingdon, East and North Herts and UCLH, so that we can make sure that where essential maintenance or infrastructure investment requirements need to be taken, those four parties are all part of that discussion.
You see, what worries me is that because we know that there are existing and long-term cost implications and fitness for purpose implications for the buildings as we stand, any acute authority coming to take over in any form at all is going to want to know that they're taking over with a fairly clean bill of health, as it were. Hillingdon are unlikely to be in a financial position to deliver that, especially given the diversion that is likely to be with regard to the building of the new hospital. So is there any sense, do you think, of any jeopardy in terms of UCLH taking over? Because essentially they're never going to get to a position, are they, where they can be satisfied that what they're taking over doesn't have a massive cost implication for them?
So I think there's two parts to that. So from a UCLH point of view, there's a question about the assurance of the risks that they would carry from the point at which they are accountable for the management and the delivery of those services. So the risks on day one, and then an assurance about the future provision of the services and the timeline to deliver that. And that would include, for example, some assurances that the capital would be available to enable that re-provision to be funded. And that is something that I think we discussed on the phone a few weeks ago. We are working on at the moment. So so both of those things UCLH will require assurances about before their board would be comfortable to take that decision about the management of those services.
Yeah.
And that's partly why the due diligence process is quite a lengthy process. It is about every asset that is used by the Mount Vernon Cancer Centre on the site. And it's also about the workforce. It's quite a complex process, actually.
Well, yes, I can imagine it would be. Again, because you've got the very stark issue about the fact that there are these buildings which are essentially crumbling. And we know that, and we've done that for a long time. And for various reasons, they either haven't been demolished and rebuilt or made better. And that's just carried on and carried on. But I think the other thing is that all our members would be wanting to have fairly solid assurance about is that either existing and or new services will and are being contemplated positively staying on the site, because when you look at that map, it's an enormous area that you're covering in terms of provision. So it makes sense to have centres dotted about that area, doesn't it? Albeit with tertiary authorities or tertiary hospitals, as it were, in the background, but that the provision of services at the Mount Vernon site is a given, as it were. So there won't come a time when there will be none there at all.
So I think at the moment we haven't really got to develop the options in sufficient detail to be able to honestly answer that question. So we are asking the clinical work stream to look at what are from the clinically acceptable models, which were the ones that were outlined by the independent clinical review. What is the preferred clinical model, which would then look at, do you move all the services on the Mount Vernon site to another acute site, and what are the benefits and disbenefits of doing that? And there could be some benefits to doing that. So by focusing all the services on one site, you've not only got the benefits which I described earlier, but for example, you may attract more research income and delivery, because there's more opportunity for that on that site. It may make a difference to attracting the clinical workforce. Mount Vernon is very fortunate; it has a stable clinical workforce. So we need to encourage people to continue to want to work at wherever the new Mount Vernon is reprovisioned. So I think there are a number of different factors that we need to take into account. But we're only part way through that process at the moment. And then, of course, there is, I have to say, a financial consideration. What is the difference in cost, both capital and revenue, from running a distributed or a more distributed model to centralising it? So there's a lot of work to be done before we can get to that point.
All right, thank you. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. You'll have to excuse me if I'm not fully up to date, being a new member of the committee, but is there any joint working between the reimagining or the services being looked at Mount Vernon and the redevelopment of the hospital? Are there opportunities that are being looked at to maybe the acute services that you need to transfer being part of that? Or is it just completely siloed thinking?
No, I'm pleased to say it's not siloed thinking. The way that we're addressing that is obviously the North West London ICS, who I'm sure have met with your committee already. We are engaging with them to understand what do they think the needs of that population are, and then that conversation will encompass discussions with Hillingdon and other hospitals in the area. So we're going to do that through the ICS, but we are in frequent discussion actually with Hillingdon. So I think still an ongoing conversation. ICSs are quite new, so we need to develop that conversation further. But we're meeting with the North West London ICS tomorrow, as it happens.
One of the points about this project and about the review of Mount Vernon Cancer Centre services, Councillor Mathers, was that it started at a time when the decision about a new build hospital at Hillingdon hadn't even been made, or at least hadn't been. I mean, we've been wanting a new hospital for as long as I can remember. So, but in terms of a direct decision and funding and all the rest of it, and as I said at the beginning, I think very sensibly the decision in relation to Mount Vernon, even though it's a Hillingdon site, was to get on with that review. Because I remember making the point at the time at an earlier stage, and Ruth and Jasmine will remember, do we wait and see what happens at the new hospital and see if the services can be incorporated in that, and do we see what the shape of the new hospital is, so maybe it becomes a tertiary cancer centre, who knows? And really the answer was, well, we can't delay this one on the indefinite not understanding as to whether or not the new hospital would get the go ahead at all at that early stage. So I think what's having to happen is that this project is having to sort of fit in with the new timetable and the new redevelopment and see where we can get some joined up thinking. Because one of the other issues, undoubtedly, at some point is going to be what happens to the Mount Vernon site in regard to the new hospital. How's it going to be used? Is it going to be used? Is the new build going to mean, for example, that services en masse in some temporary way might get transferred to the Mount Vernon site with new pop-up provision for a very short term while the new hospital is built? There's all sorts of possibilities, I guess. I mean, that's not something official, it's just something that popped into my head. But, I think it's difficult because we've now got the go-ahead for the new hospital, and everything now has got to be thought in terms of that as well. And I'm happy to see Ruth nodding on that one as well. Good. All right, Jasmine, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, as Ruth said, we've been meeting regularly with Hillingdon. We're meeting regularly with all the ICSs in the patch. We're meeting regularly with all the hospitals. We're very keen not to work in silos, but also I was just thinking there are other things that we can be doing around the service. And one of the things that I'm quite excited about seeing is what comes out through these patient focus groups and so on, is we've been looking at each of the pathways and how it differs depending on which hospital you start at. So if I take breast cancer, for example, as it's one of the larger ones, if you are a Luton patient and you go to Luton Hospital and you have your surgery there, you can have your chemotherapy there. It's all overseen by a Mount Vernon clinician, but you have it very, very locally. Sorry, I'm getting some interference. I'm not sure if that's me. I'm not sure. So you can have that very, very locally in Luton, all overseen and managed by the Mount Vernon team. If you are a Hillingdon or a Watford patient, you can't have chemotherapy at your local hospital. You come into Mount Vernon for that. So there are differences, and that's just one example on one of the pathways. And so what's interesting me around the work we're doing on the pathways and with the patients is why are things different? What works and what doesn't? And are there opportunities to put some of these services into the local hospitals that we haven't done previously? So regardless of where Mount Vernon ends up, as it were. So I think whilst we talk about a new cancer centre on an acute hospital site, that doesn't preclude enhanced services in other hospitals around the catchment. And I think that's what excites me in terms of how we can improve local access.
I suppose inevitably, because we are Hillingdon focused and more concerned about Hillingdon, and just looking at the figures and the percentages, and I may be getting this completely wrong. We're the third, as it were, or sort of, well, maybe second if you lump Eastern All Parts and Hearts together, at 13%, and so I'm assuming that's 13% of 100. Therefore, 87% of our patients, and you said they related to individual patients, sort of go somewhere else, or is that a wrong interpretation?
That's 87% of Mount Vernon patients are not from Hillingdon. They come from somewhere else.
Okay.
So it's not Hillingdon data. So we do need to look at where Hillingdon patients go, and that's something we need to do with North West London. So we're hopeful that in our meeting with them tomorrow, we can start to flesh out some of that information about where patients go who are living in North West London. You know, is 13% 100% of Hillingdon patients, or are some going somewhere else? We suspect the majority of them. I mean, that 13% may well be 100% of Hillingdon patients, or close to that. But there will be some variation. There will be some other hospitals that they go to as well, because you've obviously got Royal Marsden and other places that provide tertiary cancer care.
So what that doesn't mean is that 87% of Hillingdon patients go somewhere else, not to Mount Vernon.
No, it simply means that 87% of patients from Mount Vernon are not from Hillingdon; they're from further away.
Okay, and so all right. So, but if somebody in Hillingdon, again, this is probably just sort of trying to get one's head around it. If somebody in Hillingdon has cancer and needs cancer services of the type that Mount Vernon can provide, then obviously they would prefer to be close because it's Mount Vernon and it's geographically close to them. If then, for whatever reason, those services are taken away as a consequence of the review and the whole big picture, they then are going to be required to travel, or maybe not, depending on the nature of the provision. So how is that whole sort of travel and being able to use a local facility being looked at?
So we've done already a lot of work around the travel times. We've done that for each of the services. So patients will attend Mount Vernon for a whole range of services. So we've looked at the travel times for each of those. And I think what we need to do around this is, if there is a proposal that patients travel further, and it's our ambition that we don't have a model in which patients have to travel further, but if that's the case, then I think what we need to do is be very explicit about the distance, what can be provided locally, where patients have to travel, and for which service they have to travel. But those are some of the nuances of the clinical model that we're working through at the moment. The other things that we'd like to look at in terms of the travel times is not only the car travel times, but the public transport travel times and the impact of transport on deprived populations across the whole of the Mount Vernon catchment. So there's quite a lot of complex work to be done around travel. I think what we need first is what are the acceptable clinical models, which are the preferred ones, and then do the detailed work around the travel that could be associated with those, because for all patients that's going to be a really important feature.
When we were talking previously, we were and looking at the tertiary provider, one of the things that came up was that some of the treatments would be dealt with by that hospital, and then a sort of outreach, ongoing sequence of treatments, maybe to Mount Vernon, maybe further afield. If it is UCLH and they do eventually take this on, is there likely to be more work, as it were, for Mount Vernon on the basis that it's that if you're shooting from UCLH up into that whole map that we've got, which is essentially a kind of eastern fan going upwards up the country, and so Mount Vernon is kind of the first stop geographically in that sense, and then others. Is there provision? Is there going to be thought for provision of outreach treatment to each of the areas, or a catchment area that Mount Vernon is the sort of bottom of the cone, as it were?
We would certainly look at that. We haven't done all of that work yet, but we would certainly look at what all those options are. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, thank you. Well, look, I don't know if anybody else has got any other questions. Everyone seems to have been scribbling away and taking notes and so forth, which is very helpful. But unless anyone's got anything further, thank you very much for the update. I know you'll keep in contact with us, and we're in contact quite frequently anyway. And if there's anything specific other than the regular get-togethers that we'll have both for the committee and elsewhere that we can help with, obviously we will. So unless there are any other specific questions, thank you both very much indeed. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman,
Okay.
could I ask a brief question or make a suggestion?
Yes.
Perhaps when we come back to your committee on the next occasion, it might be helpful if we came with North West London ICS as well, so they can talk, share the discussion about the population needs from their perspective.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I see Nikki's jotting that one down. All right. Okay, Jasmine and Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, so on we go. Work programme, Nikki.
Thank you, Chairman. Our next meeting is on the 10th of November, and at that meeting we will be receiving updates from each of the trusts. Obviously, the impacts of COVID-19 will probably feature quite heavily in that, but there will also be updates from Hillingdon Hospital within their update about the hospital redevelopment, but also about the CQC inspection that they had recently. We're expecting the report to be published at some point this month. Unfortunately, it's not published yet, which is why they're not actually scheduled to attend this meeting. But we should hopefully get some further information on the 10th of November. The next meeting after that, on the 12th of January, it was suggested and agreed at the last meeting that we would look at rail services. So Councillor Mathers has very kindly provided me with some additional information on what he's suggesting we look at, which is, in summary, it's a look at the update on station developments, timelines and progress, local communications with the residents that actually live in the vicinity of the developments, bus access at the stations and station access for those people actually using the services, crime reduction and grounds maintenance, so where the areas of land between the actual lines and the outside world, the public areas, or between the gardens of local residents and the railway lines, whether that's being maintained and how that's being maintained. Other than that, I have nothing more to add, other than next meeting, I would suggest we stick with being virtual, but it would be entirely up to you members.
Well, we'll have a think about that. Another topic in terms of work program, and it occurred to me as a consequence of something that's been bubbling away and now to an extent resolved. Do you remember we did something about post offices a little while ago? And the recent decision by the post office to essentially, to not challenge the appeals by people who were running the post office. And there was this whole issue about how vast numbers of employees, essentially, or contracted employees who ran post offices were essentially accused of fraud and all sorts of other things. And it I think simplistically put, it's come about that it turns out that it was a systems failure rather than a dishonest and an individual failure. And I wondered if there's anything it was worth just having a look at that at some stage with the Hillingdon perspective. I don't know, and I have no idea if this is right or not, whether any local post office people were affected by that. But if it was the case, it might be interesting to have a look at that, just as a part of another meeting, maybe, because it won't take desperately long, but just to see what's going on. Right, Councillor Brightman first, please, and then Councillor Brightman anyway, and then Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman. With regard to the issue that Councillor Mathers raised about January, provided some information about the January investigation into the rail services, will that include the delays to Crossrail and how they can perhaps be sped up, improved? So I
think that's a huge topic, but I'm sure we can have a look at that and touch on it and see what this. It's not necessarily something that we can do influence locally, but I think it's a good point. Okay, but it's something we can factor into that. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman. You raised the issue about the post office, and I would like us to perhaps have a review and ask the post office management to come back and have a word with us. The reason being, a lot of our local areas that had sub-post office, a lot of the local shops are refusing to take that on, and maybe it might give them some joy in regards to thinking of reopening the local post offices again, because we got quite a lot of pockets within the borough that have to travel very far to access the post office. I'm just wondering if we can call them back and for them to give us a review in regards to the court case and the outcome, to see if they will be able to go back to those post offices that has given up the franchise because of the fraud that was aimed at individuals, to see whether they will reconsider opening the local post offices that's nearby for those of people with disability and elderly who cannot get very far to access their local post office.
Yeah, I apocryphally, I know that a number of potential contracts during the course of this case and before it went to court, there were problems because people just didn't want to take on the role because they were concerned about what had been happening to individual what used to be called postmasters and postmistresses, because of the way in which that had been handled. And I think you're right that a lot of potential service provision had gone astray because of the concerns that people had. If they took this thing on, suddenly somehow they were going to be in difficulties, and that the whole scene has changed as far as that's concerned. And it's quite interesting, as I say, that most of these people, well, all of them, I think it's right to say, who were facing not just criminal charges but civil charges for recoveries of monies that they had not taken, that the post office is not challenging any of their appeals, and a number of them are, well, all of them, I should imagine, are greatly relieved. So I think we can work something into that as well. All right, Nikki, anything else on future work programme?
With regards to the post office, I don't know if members remember, but last time we had to wait quite a long time for them to attend our meeting, and they actually eventually attended in January this year. I will obviously contact them, but I'm not sure when I'll be able to put it onto the work programme. So if it's okay with you, we'll play that one by ear to see how I can actually fit it into the work programme.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. All right. Well, unless there's anything else from anybody else, good point, Councillor Brightman, about the Crossrail. I think we'll more think about it. I think we will look into that and see what's going on. Okay. Well, if there's nothing further on the work programme, I think I can draw things to a close. Can I ask members to hang on after we've ceased the recording? Over to you, Nikki.
If I can please ask members to remain on silent until I confirm that the feed has finished.